The morning sun painted golden streaks across Cedar Park as Mr. James Wilson settled onto his favorite bench, the same spot he'd claimed every morning for the past 15 years. At 68, he moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent decades teaching young minds, his retirement from being a high school principal giving him the freedom to enjoy these peaceful moments. The worn wooden bench had become such a part of his routine that the groundskeeper often joked it should have a plaque with his name. The familiar creak of the wooden slats welcomed him as he lowered himself down, his hands automatically reaching for the paper bag of breadcrumbs in his coat pocket. The morning air carried the fresh scent of newly cut grass and blooming spring flowers. A small group of pigeons already waited nearby, recognizing their old friend. Mr. Wilson smiled, remembering how his late wife used to tease him about having breakfast meetings with his feathered companions. He scattered the first handful of crumbs, watching as the birds hopped forward with their peculiar bobbing walk. "Good morning, everyone," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of a grandfather telling stories to his grandchildren. Regular park visitors would wave as they passed by, the young mother pushing her twins in a stroller, the elderly couple who power-walked every morning, and the newspaper vendor who knew everyone's names. Mr. Wilson had become such a fixture in the park that parents often pointed him out to their children, calling him the bird whisperer. As he reached into his bag for another handful of crumbs, he noticed new spring flowers blooming along the pathway. The park maintenance team had outdone themselves this year, planting vibrant tulips and daffodils that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The colors reminded him of the garden his wife had lovingly tended for over 40 years. A young blue jay swooped down to join the pigeons, causing a minor commotion among the gathered birds. Mr. Wilson chuckled, reminded of his days managing cafeteria drama in high school. Now, he said, spreading the crumbs wider, "There's enough for everyone." His voice carried the same patient tone he used with thousands of students over his 35-year career in education. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, opening it to look at the small photo he kept of his graduating class from 5 years ago, his last year as principal. Those bright young faces still brought a smile to his face. Many of them still stopped by to visit him here in the park, sharing their college stories or introducing their young families. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the oak leaves above him and creating dancing patterns on the pathway. Mr. Wilson closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth on his face. These peaceful moments meant everything to him now, especially after losing his wife 2 years ago. The park had become his sanctuary, a place where memories lived in every corner and hope bloomed with each new sunrise. A light breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sounds of the city waking up. More regular morning visitors began appearing on the paths, joggers with their earbuds, dog walkers chatting quietly, and early morning photographers capturing the golden hour light. Each person who passed gave a friendly nod or wave to Mr. Wilson, acknowledging the familiar presence that had become part of their own morning routines. He reached the bottom of his paper bag just as a new flock of sparrows joined the gathering. Looking at his watch, a retirement gift from his fellow teachers, he noticed it was almost time for his morning coffee at the small cafe across from the park. The young barista there always had his order ready, one medium coffee with a touch of cream, no sugar, just the way he liked it. As Mr. Wilson carefully folded the empty paper bag to dispose of it properly, he reflected on how these simple morning rituals had helped him find purpose after retirement. The park had become more than just a place to feed birds. It was where he continued to be part of a community, where every morning brought new stories and familiar faces together in the quiet dawn of another day. The peaceful morning shattered when heavy footsteps approached Mr. Wilson's bench. Officer Michael Davies, barely 6 months out of the police academy, walked with the kind of authority that came from inexperience rather than wisdom. His polished badge caught the morning sun as he adjusted his belt, making sure his hand rested near his equipment, a gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed by the elderly man on the bench. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Officer Davies announced, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone trying too hard to sound official. He positioned himself directly in front of Mr. Wilson, casting a shadow over the scattered breadcrumbs and sending the birds scattering in all directions. Mr. Wilson's heart skipped a beat, but decades of experience as a high school principal had taught him how to maintain composure in tense situations. He looked up at the young officer, noting how the man couldn't be much older than some of his former students. "Good morning, officer," he responded calmly, his hands remaining visible and steady. "May I ask what seems to be the problem?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Officer Davies replied, his eyes scanning the empty paper bag and Mr. Wilson's worn leather briefcase. The morning joggers and dog walkers who usually greeted Mr. Wilson had slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Mr. Wilson felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times over his 68 years. "I've been coming to this park every morning for 15 years, officer," he explained, his voice carrying the patient tone he'd used with countless troubled students. "I'm just feeding the birds and enjoying the morning air." The young officer shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the gravel path. "Park regulations strictly prohibit feeding wildlife," he stated, though no such sign existed in the park. His hand hadn't moved from his belt, and his stance remained unnecessarily defensive. "I'm going to need to see some form of identification immediately." A cool morning breeze rustled through the trees, carrying away the last remnants of peace that had surrounded the bench just moments before. Mr. Wilson slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and careful. The leather was warm from sitting in his pocket, and his fingers brushed against the class photo he kept inside, a reminder of happier moments. "I was the principal at Lincoln High School for over 20 years, Mr. Wilson said softly, removing his ID with steady hands. "You might have heard of our science program. We won the state championships 3 years in a row." He tried to establish a human connection, just as he had done countless times with aggressive students in his office. Officer Davies barely glanced at the ID, his attention instead drawn to the paper bag on the bench. "What's in the bag, sir?" he demanded, though the empty bag clearly showed traces of breadcrumbs. The morning sun had risen higher now, and more park visitors had gathered at a distance, their morning routines interrupted by the escalating situation. "It's just breadcrumbs, officer," Mr. Wilson replied, maintaining his dignity despite the growing knot in his chest. "Would you like to see?" He carefully picked up the bag, holding it open for inspection. A few remaining crumbs sprinkled onto his pressed trousers. The officer's radio crackled, breaking the tense silence. Instead of diffusing the situation, Officer Davies seemed to grow more agitated. "Stand up, sir," he ordered, his voice rising. "How long have you been conducting these activities in the park?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Mr. Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cane, not from fear, but from the deep wariness of facing such situations throughout his life. The same bench where he had shared countless morning conversations with passersby now felt like an interrogation chair. Regular park visitors who knew Mr. Wilson had stopped their morning routines entirely, watching with a mix of concern and disbelief. The newspaper vendor across the path had set down his stack of papers, his face creased with worry for the man who bought his paper every Sunday. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension, keeping their distance from the scene that unfolded in their usual breakfast spot. Behind the tense scene unfolding at the park bench, Mrs. Chen was just rounding the corner on her usual morning jog. A respected civil rights attorney with 20 years of experience, she had developed an instinct for recognizing trouble. The sight before her made her slow her pace, her running shoes silent against the paved path. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as she observed the officer's aggressive stance toward the elderly man she'd seen countless times during her morning runs. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold, but years of courtroom experience had taught her the value of careful observation before taking action. Keeping her movements subtle, Mrs. Chen pulled her phone from her running armband. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, starting the video recording without drawing attention. The morning dew still clung to the grass around her shoes as she positioned herself to capture the entire interaction clearly. Through her phone screen, she could see every detail more clearly now: the officer's hand refusing to move from his belt, the elderly man's dignified posture despite his obvious distress, and the growing crowd of concerned onlookers. The morning birds had gone quiet, as if they too were watching the scene with apprehension. Mrs. Chen's mind raced through various legal precedents as she documented the interaction. She'd handled dozens of similar cases throughout her career, But something about this situation, perhaps the gentle way the elderly man had always smiled and waved to her during her morning runs, made her heart beat faster with concern. The cool morning air carried snippets of conversation to where she stood. "Sir, I've asked you multiple times about your purpose here." The officer's voice rang out, unnecessarily loud for the quiet morning. Mrs. Chen noticed how he positioned himself to tower over the seated man, a clear intimidation tactic she'd seen too many times in her career. She checked her phone screen to ensure she was capturing every detail. The officer's badge number clearly visible in the morning light, the timestamp in the corner of the video, the way the elderly man kept his hands visible and his voice steady despite the officer's increasingly aggressive tone. Years of presenting evidence in court had taught her the importance of documenting every detail. Regular park visitors had formed small clusters nearby, their morning routines forgotten as they watched with growing concern. Mrs. Chen recognized many of them. The coffee shop owner who was always sweeping his storefront, the young mother who walked her children to school, the retired crossing guard who now spent his mornings reading on a nearby bench. All of them knew the elderly man as a peaceful, friendly presence in their community. The morning traffic hummed in the distance as Mrs. Chen continued recording, her legal mind already preparing the documentation she would need. She noted how the officer repeatedly cut off the elderly man's attempts to explain himself, how he kept glancing at the empty bread bag as if it were evidence of some grave offense. Through her phone screen, she watched as the elderly man tried to reach for his cane, only to have the officer sharply order him to keep his hands visible. Mrs. Chen's jaw tightened. She'd seen this scenario play out too many times before, but never with someone who had become such a familiar part of her morning routine, someone whose gentle presence had added warmth to countless dawns. The growing crowd of onlookers provided additional witnesses, their concerned faces visible in her recording. Some had their own phones out now, but Mrs. Chen knew her position offered the clearest view of the interaction. Her years of experience had taught her the importance of having irrefutable evidence, especially in situations where power was being misused. With steady hands, she continued documenting every moment, every word exchanged. The morning sun had risen higher now, eliminating shadows that might have obscured any detail of the interaction. She knew that soon she would need to step forward, but for now, she was gathering the evidence that would ensure this incident couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The situation at the park bench grew more tense with each passing moment. Mr. Wilson's hands trembled slightly as he tried once again to show his identification, the morning sun catching the gold lettering of Lincoln High School principal on his retired faculty ID card. "Officer, I can explain everything if you'll just give me a moment," he said, his voice carrying decades of experience in staying calm during difficult situations. Officer Davies shifted his stance, moving even closer to the bench. His shadow now completely blocked out the morning light that had been warming Mr. Wilson's face just minutes earlier. "Sir, I've already told you that feeding wildlife is against park regulations," he insisted, though no such sign was posted anywhere in the park. His voice had taken on an edge that made nearby dog walkers pause their conversations. The small group of pigeons that had scattered earlier now watched from a safe distance, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere around their regular morning friend. The paper bag with remaining breadcrumbs lay crumpled on the bench, looking impossibly harmless in contrast to the officer's aggressive stance. "I've been coming here every morning for 15 years, Mr. Wilson explained again, his dignity intact despite the growing fear in his chest. He gripped his cane tighter, its familiar wooden handle providing some comfort. "Ask anyone here, the newspaper vendor, the coffee shop owner, even the park maintenance staff. They all know me." The officer's radio crackled again, making him jump slightly. Instead of calming the situation, this seemed to agitate him further. "Stand up slowly," he commanded, his hands still hovering near his belt. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Mr. Wilson's legs felt heavy as he carefully began to rise from his bench, leaning on his cane for support. His pressed trousers and neat sweater, the same kind he'd worn during his teaching days, were dusted with breadcrumbs. The morning breeze carried away the last few crumbs, along with any remaining piece from what had started as a typical morning. Several regular park visitors had stopped pretending to go about their routines. The young mother who usually passed by with her twins had pulled out her phone, while the elderly couple who power walked every morning stood nearby, their faces etched with concern. Even the grounds maintenance worker had stopped his leaf blowing, the machine's silence making the officer's harsh tone even more pronounced. "I don't appreciate your tone, sir," Officer Davies continued, misinterpreting Mr. Wilson's careful movements as defiance. "When a police officer gives you an order, you need to comply immediately." The morning sun glinted off his badge as he took another step forward, using his height to loom over Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson's heart raced, but his voice remained steady, the same voice that had calmed countless school assemblies and diffused numerous teenage conflicts. "Officer, I am complying. I'm just an old man who needs his cane to stand up properly." He kept his movements slow and deliberate, just as he'd always advised his students to do in tense situations. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger now. The coffee shop owner across the street stood in his doorway, his morning customers forgotten as they too watched the scene unfold. The newspaper vendor had set aside his stack of papers, his familiar friendly face now creased with worry for the man who bought his Sunday edition every week. Through it all, Mr. Wilson maintained his composure, though his hand gripped his cane tighter. The morning sun, now high enough to cast shorter shadows, illuminating the ridiculous nature of the situation, an elderly man being treated like a threat for feeding birds in a public park. "I've helped shape young minds in this community for over 3 decades, Mr. Wilson said softly, more to himself than the officer. "I've attended graduations, weddings, and even the retirement parties of my former students. This park has been my morning sanctuary since I retired." His words carried the weight of a life dedicated to public service, making the officer's aggressive stance seem even more out of place. Mrs. Chen had seen enough. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward from her observation point, her running shoes making soft sounds against the morning damp path. "Excuse me, officer," she called out, her voice clear and professional. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and I've been recording this entire interaction." The morning light caught the screen of her phone as she held it steady, still recording. The officer's head snapped toward her voice, his stance shifting slightly as he registered her presence. The small crowd of onlookers seemed to collectively hold their breath, the park going quiet except for the distant sound of early traffic. "I've been watching for the past several minutes," Mrs. Chen continued, her tone carrying the weight of 20 years of courtroom experience. She moved with deliberate steps, positioning herself where both she and her phone could clearly capture the officer's badge number. "I'd like to point out that there are no posted regulations against feeding birds in this park." Mr. Wilson remained standing, his cane steady beneath his hand, as Mrs. Chen approached. The morning sun now highlighted the absurdity of the situation, an elderly man in a neat sweater, surrounded by scattered breadcrumbs, being treated like a threat to public safety. "Ma'am, this is a police matter," Officer Davies said, his voice losing some of its earlier aggression. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back." His hand had finally moved away from his belt, though his posture remained tense. Mrs. Chen smiled professionally, the kind of smile that had preceded many successful court arguments. "Actually, Officer Davies," she said, glancing at his nameplate, "this became a civil rights matter the moment you began harassing a citizen without probable cause." She adjusted her phone's angle slightly, ensuring the timestamp remained visible. The gathered crowd had grown silent, watching the scene unfold. The coffee shop owner had stepped fully out of his store now, coffee pot still in hand. The young mother with twins had moved closer, her own phone still recording. Even the birds seemed to be watching from their perches in nearby trees. "As I'm sure you're aware," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "citizens have the right to enjoy public spaces without unwarranted interference. Mr. Wilson here has been a beloved member of this community for decades." She gestured toward the crowd of nodding onlookers, her running jacket catching the sunlight. Officer Davies shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the numerous phones recording the incident. The morning had grown warmer, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "I was responding to reports of suspicious activity," he said, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "And what exactly was suspicious about an elderly gentleman feeding birds?" Mrs. Chen asked, though her tone made it clear she wasn't expecting an answer. "I've already sent this video to my law firm and to the police department's internal affairs division. I'd be happy to provide you with my card." Mr. Wilson stood a little straighter now, though his hand still gripped his cane tightly. The morning breeze rustled through the trees, carrying away some of the tension that had built up over the past several minutes. A few brave pigeons had returned to the area, pecking at the scattered breadcrumbs near the bench. In my experience, Mrs. Chen continued, reaching into her running jacket's pocket for a business card, the best way to handle this situation would be to acknowledge the misunderstanding and allow Mr. Wilson to return to his peaceful morning routine. Her words were firm but offered the officer a graceful way to step back. The growing crowd of park regulars had begun to murmur supportively. The newspaper vendor called out, "Mr. Wilson's been brightening our mornings for years." Others joined in with similar comments, their voices creating a gentle chorus of community support. Mrs. Chen maintained her professional demeanor, though her eyes showed compassion as she glanced at Mr. Wilson. The morning sun now fully illuminated the park, as if nature itself was shining a light on the truth of the situation. "Officer," she said, "I believe we all want the same thing. A peaceful, safe community where everyone can enjoy their mornings without fear or harassment." The park incident wasn't just another day in the city, it was about to become a turning point. When the video started spreading like wildfire across social media, phones were buzzing with messages, and people couldn't stop talking about what happened to Harold. At first, the police department tried to brush things under the rug. But this time was different. The community wasn't going to stay quiet. Local community leaders, students, and everyday citizens started showing up at city council meetings. They brought printed screenshots, shared the video, and demanded answers. Harold found himself at the center of something much bigger than he'd ever expected. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news channels wanted interviews, civil rights organizations reached out, and people he'd never met were sending messages of support. The soft-spoken retired teacher who loved reading in the park was now becoming a symbol of resistance. Local attorneys approached Harold, offering to help him file a comprehensive complaint. They saw this wasn't just about one incident, it was about years of unchecked behavior that had gone unnoticed. Harold was hesitant at first. He'd spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, preferring to solve problems through education and understanding. But something had changed that day in the park. "I've taught history for over 40 years, Harold would later tell a packed community meeting. "I've always told my students that silence is the biggest friend of injustice. Today, I can't be silent anymore." The police department's initial response was defensive. They released a statement claiming the officer was following standard procedure, but the video told a different story. Every view, every share exposed the stark difference between their words and the reality captured on camera. Local activists organized peaceful protests. They stood outside the police station with signs, held community meetings in churches and community centers, and kept the conversation alive. It wasn't about attacking the entire police force, it was about creating real, meaningful change. Social media became a powerful tool. The teenage girl who first recorded the incident became an unexpected hero. Her quick thinking and courage to record had sparked a movement. Her livestream had over 1 million views, with people from across the country commenting and sharing their own experiences. Community leaders started pushing for comprehensive police reform. They demanded better training, independent oversight, and a complete review of past incidents. Harold found himself speaking at town halls, sharing his story, and listening to others who had similar experiences. The local newspaper ran a series of in-depth articles. They traced the history of similar incidents, interviewed community members, and put a human face to the statistics of racial profiling. Harold's story wasn't just his own anymore. It had become a powerful narrative about justice, dignity, and community strength. Behind the scenes, lawyers were building a case. They collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared for a potential legal battle. But this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about creating lasting change. As weeks turned into months, the momentum didn't slow down. The incident had touched a nerve, bringing people together in ways no one had expected. Harold, who had always been a quiet observer, was now at the forefront of a movement he never planned to lead. "I'm just an old teacher who loves reading in the park," he would often say with a gentle smile. But sometimes standing up is the only thing you can do. The story was far from over, but one thing was clear: nothing would be the same again. The park bench that once held just another afternoon now felt like a symbol of something much bigger. Harold never imagined he'd become the center of a movement, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. The city began to change, slowly but surely. Those mandatory training sessions weren't just another box to check. Police officers started having real conversations about respect, understanding, and community. The young officer who had confronted Harold was going through his own journey of reflection and growth. At community centers and local schools, Harold found himself sharing his story. He wasn't looking to be a hero, he was just an old teacher who believed in speaking truth. His talks weren't angry speeches filled with blame. Instead, they were gentle lessons about dignity, about standing up, about the power of staying calm in the face of injustice. Young people started seeking him out. They'd approach after his talks, eyes bright with understanding. "My grandfather told me stories like this," one high school student said, "but hearing it from you makes it real." Harold would smile, touch the old notebook he always carried, and share another story. The local police department wasn't the same anymore. They started community dialogue programs, invited local residents to speak at their training sessions. Harold was often one of those speakers, but he never saw it as a victory. To him, it was just conversation, the kind that helps people understand each other. His neighborhood changed too. People who had just been neighbors before now felt like family. The park where everything happened became a meeting place. On weekends, you'd see groups gathering, talking, sharing stories. Children played while adults discussed community improvements. The bench where Harold used to sit became almost sacred, a reminder of the day everything changed. The teenage girl who recorded the original video, she won a community leadership award. Her courage had sparked something important. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was a changemaker. Schools started teaching about the power of standing up, about using technology to protect rights. Harold's family watched all of this with a mix of pride and amazement. His grandchildren would ask him to tell the story again and again. "Tell us about the day you stood up in the park," they'd say. And he would, always ending with a lesson about respect and understanding. But it wasn't all perfect. There were still challenges. Racism didn't disappear overnight. But something has shifted. People were talking. People were listening. And that was the real victory. At community meetings, Harold would often say something that stuck with people. Change doesn't happen in big dramatic moments. It happens in conversations. It happens when we see each other as human beings. The local newspaper did a follow-up story a year later. They interviewed Harold, the police chief, community leaders. But more importantly, they talked to everyday people. How had things changed? What had they learned? The story wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a community learning, growing, healing. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter their age, race, or background, deserves respect. Harold still visited the park. He still sat on his favorite bench. He still read his books and wrote in his notebook. But now, when people passed by, they'd smile. They'd nod. Some would stop and chat. The park bench had become more than just a place to sit. It was a symbol of hope. A reminder that one moment of courage can change everything. Epilogue. Some stories end. Some stories continue. This was a story of continuous transformation, of a community learning to see each other, to listen, to understand. And it all started with an old teacher, a park bench, and the simple act of standing up with dignity.